Hi, everybody. Welcome to another live stream from on this day in Canadian military history. Today, we're going to be talking about Operation Veritable, grenade, and the push to the Rhine, and a really interesting project of a documentary series, several-part series about all the opportunities, or sorry, the campaign and kind of what that went with all its various interesting parts that are not, in my opinion, talked about enough. So today I've got Jesse Alexander with me today, who is part of the documentary team, doing all the research, all the great stuff, visiting the sites. So if everyone can help me in welcoming Jesse, and we'll get started. Hey, Jesse, how are you?
Hi, Brad. I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This is really a really cool one to be talking about. I mean, this is a topic. I mean, we were just talking about this. That's not talked about enough. I think it's a really interesting campaign. I think it's a misunderstood campaign in a lot of ways. So I think you guys, the work you've been doing with the company you're working with, has been doing a lot of interesting way of looking at this, kind of from the public history angle, which, in my opinion, and I think even practically speaking, has not been done enough. So if you could just kind of give me a quick overview of kind of what the thinking was with what you guys are doing, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the campaign, and then get to the film and other stuff later.
Sure. Yeah. So what we wanted to do, we meaning a production company called Real Time History, based in Berlin, and I'm based in Vienna, in Austria, but I work closely with them, and we do documentaries about different historical topics. We have a YouTube channel about the Great War. We did a 5-hour series on the Battle of Berlin, and then we decided, what else are we going to do? What's our next independent crowd-funded film going to be? And we hit on the Rhineland campaign in 1945 for a few different reasons, some practical reasons, which we can talk about maybe a bit later. But we wanted, we wanted to break out of the mold in a sense. I think the meta-narrative for the Northwestern Europe campaign is sort of Normandy, Arnhem, failed attempt to cross the Rhine, then the Battle of the Bulge, everyone, gets a shock, and then it's kind of over. Like, then we win, right? And the things in between that, now for Canadians, there's the Scheldt and the liberation of the rest of Holland as well in 45. But on both of those counts, the Canadian narrative and maybe the meta international narrative, the Rhineland campaign in February and March, and Operation Veritable, Operation Grenade, and then the crossing of the river itself doesn't quite have the same resonance, even though, as I hope we can bring across in the film and in our chat today, I mean, this is like an extremely tough fought campaign and kind of a dramatic one in a way as well. I mean, 3 VCs just for the Canadians, for example, another British one, and several medals of honor, not to mention the Knights Crosses on the other side, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots going on here, and I'm just going to quickly pull up. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Because to me, the maps that have come out of this, they are part of the official history, the Stacey history, which we've talked about, and kind of how great they are for kind of our purposes, your purposes, kind of that everything that comes out of them. I mean, they're well done. And I mean, but that we can talk about kind of the campaign here, and because you've been on the ground, kind of, obviously it's changed. It's not like it was, back then, because of, like, as you can see from the map there in the north, the Canadian initial part where they're starting is underwater. But I mean, this map, I mean, to me, it's just one of the more striking maps of all of, even the victory campaign, the Stacey book. But even just generally speaking, this campaign is so fascinating to me because of the ground.
Well, the ground it almost characterizes the fighting in this campaign. It nearly exclusively. I mean, of course, there's a certain role about decision making and so on, but that all goes out the window when a tank can't really move in the mud, for example, right? So there's a whole bunch of different factors that come together that make it a difficult campaign to be on the offensive. So the Rhine is flooded. Every other river in the area is flooded, not only because it's the late winter rainy and flooding season anyway, but of course the Germans are bursting different dikes and all that sort of thing to make it even worse. And the 3rd Division ends up kind of island hopping between villages that are essentially islands, right? And so they're moving with these amphibious buffalo vehicles from village to village and trying to fight that way, which is no fun for anyone, including my grandfather, who was with the 3rd Division later in the campaign towards the end.
Right.
And this it's farmland, right? It's relatively flat. That's why it was selected as the main Allied push for this period in time. So the Americans eventually cross at Remagen, which is, very famous and so on. But the terrain down there is extremely rough on the eastern bank. And this terrain's a lot more promising. So that's why the kind of weight gets put here for the time being anyway.
Right.
But those flat farm fields are soaked. And so good luck trying to impose mobile warfare on the Germans, which is kind of the intention. Because we know, the Allies, I always slip into that. That's a fatal sin to keep the distance. But, the Allies want to...
it's hard not to do that.
The mobile warfare on the Germans, who they know cannot conduct mobile warfare anymore.
Right, not at this point. I mean, we'll get to some... I can show some pictures later of kind of... I think that really... encapsulate kind of what the Germans more or less were forced to do. I mean, they can't move. They have so little resources left. And I mean, we can talk about that maybe a bit later. But I mean, just starting again, like you said, this sort of island hopping, I guess, because even like the pictures, they're like, yeah, you can kind of see that there's land there, but it's even that part's water, covered in water. But like even maybe we could talk about maybe further south, because like we were talking about earlier, this project is trying to be covering as multiple perspectives here, right? This isn't just Canadian. So, and I know Canadians know a little bit about this stuff, but like, and as a sin of Canadian military history, we don't talk about enough of the other units that were with us. And I think that, the movement of the 30 Corps is really interesting too, but it just kind of gets lost in the very limited narrative that there is of Veritable.
Yeah, I mean, the 30 Corps for the first phase of this campaign is running the show, right?
Right.
The Canadian units in the initial phase of Veritable, they're kind of the flanking support. Their job is to, 3rd Division's job is to capture all those flooded villages, and then 2nd Division's job is to kind of capture a couple of villages and open up the road on the banks of the Rhine, which was also partially flooded, towards the city of Kleve, which is one of the first big objectives. But it's the 30 Corps who's going to do the brunt of the fighting. And of course, the majority of 1st Canadian Army is British for this campaign, right? And so famous divisions like 51st Highland are involved and all that kind of fascinating stuff. But they end up running into the problems that the Canadians are going to run into later at the Hochwald Gap, for example, of this mobility issue. And one of the, before I get into the details, let me take one step back here, because I think it's important to remember that Veritable's one arm of this two-prong idea that Montgomery has in 21st Army. Yeah. The other arm, aside from 1st Canadian Army and Veritable, the other arm is the 9th U.S. Army and Operation Grenade, which gets no press in the U.S. scheme of things, right? Everyone's excited about Patton and all that stuff that's going on down there. But 9th Army is part of what is at this moment the main show, the main Allied effort. And it's under British command still, after the Bulge even. And its job is to move up. Yes, I see there's some people recognize how that goes. Yeah. So the idea is that grenades the U.S. forces are going to come from the south. The Canadians and British are going to come from the north. They're going to meet around the German town of Wesel and hopefully capture some intact bridges there. Now, the Americans get delayed because of this flooding, right? The river that they have to cross to start, confusingly named the Ruhr River, very similar to the Ruhr industrial area. It's massively flooded because the Germans bust up the dams south of it. And so they got to wait 2 weeks. And that's part of what makes Veritable such a difficult and hated campaign by most of the troops who participated in it. I think I can include the Germans in that assessment as well. Because the Americans are not able to come in for 2 weeks, which means the Germans can put all their best remaining paratroopers, for example, fighting on the ground against 1st Canadian Army. And then it's a snail's pace affair there for quite some time.
Yeah, and I mean, and I want to get to grenade in a bit, but I want to just go on that one thing part there. You mentioned the German paratroopers. Can you just talk about kind of I want to say real quick, but I don't think that's fair. Talk about kind of what who the Germans are, kind of what those guys have gone through up to this point, and kind of who the Allies are facing here?
Well, the Germans are in a bad way, obviously. I think that's, no surprise to anyone.
No.
But they're still able to be effective in the defense, especially in terms of Veritable. The front is so narrow. It's squished between the Rhine River on the north and the Maas River, or the Meuse River, in the south. So you really don't have a lot of wiggle room if you're a 1st Canadian Army to send, armored columns dashing through. That's the plan. That's the plan. But there's not a lot of room to make that work. So 1st Parachute Army under Alfred Schlemm is kind of leading the defense against Veritable. And they have some, questionable in terms of their combat capability, regular infantry units that have, some battalions of guys who've been wounded recently on the Eastern Front, and all older guys and stuff like that. But they also have these paratroopers who are no longer really paratroopers. They haven't been training for jumps since 1943. They've taken on conscripts who are of lesser quality than the original paratroopers were, but they still have this core, this core of capable and experienced, and probably most important, still disciplined and still maintaining their morale as far as one can expect, group of paratrooper divisions. And so that's kind of effectively what becomes the core of the German defense, is about 3 paratroop divisions plus 2 armored divisions that are then tasked with kind of putting the dozens of tanks that they still have into the most efficient positions to defend, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're like you already said, like they're in a bad way, and I mean, it's kind of laughing about the sorry, comment from Sheldrick saying a kernel of kernels, so to speak. that's pretty funny because it's kind of true. But anyway, sorry, that's funny. Anyway, like the idea that these are armored divisions is.
They're battle groups. And with a battle group, you can have 10 vehicles and you can have 100 vehicles, and it can be anywhere in between. They might have all met each other yesterday when they were thrown together in an ad hoc unit. That happens all the time in this campaign for the Germans. Yeah,
especially at the beginning and towards the end. I mean, it's and I've done a little bit of work on this myself. It's just at some points you're like, you'll hear something about, this unit get thrown in, but then, the next sentence in a older work is like, they're made up of this guy, 10 people from here. You're like, okay, that's kind of not disingenuous, but it's kind of confusing of who's actually who.
Well, the Germans themselves were confused about how to conduct operations at this stage once things get hot. So,
and I mean, we can move forward here a little bit. Sorry, I just wanted to show this one again because this kind of shows of like we were talking about real quick at the beginning there, kind of the short little, and not easy by any means, but the short little beginning attacks, especially from the 2nd Division, towards moving towards the flooded areas.
Exactly, and the idea here, you can see the road running along the banks of the Rhine. The idea is to open that up, capture those first positions, so that then the 15th Scottish Division and eventually the 43rd Wessex Division can move along the main axis of advance towards this town of Kleve, which is an important objective. Unfortunately, and Horrocks, the commander of 30 Corps, said that this was one of his more serious mistakes in the war. He got a little overexcited, thinking that the Scots are making good progress, so he sends the Wessex Division in. Unfortunately, there's nowhere for them to go. The roads are just slops of mud, and there's only one main road in that area, so there's a traffic jam that just snarls everything and then further delays the advance.
Which I think would be I think it would be kind of accurate to say that that's a major part of this campaign is traffic jams. I mean, it's just
definitely
the narrowing of the roads and everything, and then we'll get into the Hawkwall Gap and everything. Sorry, I didn't say it properly, but
right, So there are minefields everywhere as well, so it's tough to not use the roads because of the minefields. But then, if you use the roads, you're sinking to your axles, and there's not enough space for everyone. So it's a nightmare.
It becomes a nightmare very quickly, and I think that is one of the major mistakes of this is kind of sending too many in too quickly. into an area that is way too small to begin with.
And too swampy. It just keeps coming back.
Yeah,
and where it's not swampy, it's forested. And I mean, the first phase is through the Reichswald, a large state-owned forest. Now, that went better than the later forests, like Moorland Wood or the Hochwald forests, or even the forest south of Xanten around Wien causes some difficulties. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to... That's later. Sorry, I'm trying to find another one. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about Moorland Wood really quickly. Just because, again, it's got that Canadian connection. I know it's a bit later, but just that idea, maybe you could talk about more of, you just mentioned the forest, like, because you've been there, you've read so much on this, what that area looks like on the ground, what that experience was like.
Yeah, I mean, the whole region, it's kind of a copy-paste of slightly different constellations of similar elements to the battlefield. You'll have very low ridges that might be 50 meters above sea level, but they dominate for kilometers around. Like the famous Totenhügel, the Dead Man's Hill that comes up just after this. And at Moorland, it's another typical scenario where you have a small wood and you have kind of wet fields around it and a little village that can be put to good use by the defenders. There's also a castle there, kind of I guess a chateau manor is a better description. It's not built for defense.
Right.
So this wood is quite small. When you're on the ground, you're like, well, okay, it's not the size of the Hochwald, it's not the size of the Reichswald. But man, that's a tough nut to crack for the 7th Brigade, and it takes them days to do it. And from what I've read, actually, that's true. Now I'm reminded by seeing 46th Brigade, there were Scots there as well, trying to capture the wood first. They got, didn't have a good time, got withdrawn. And when the Canadian units are then sent in, I mean, there's these crazy accounts of them, like, moving forward in fields of dead Scots. And that's got to suck for morale.
Yeah, I mean, that's a part, again, like I said, with the work I've done, I mean, it was very prominent in so much of the reading I did, is this kind of morale shattering effect of seeing the dead Scots everywhere. And I mean, you can see it from the map here, right? Like, because they try to flank it and that doesn't work right away, right? They flank it, they can box them in, but they still got to take the wood.
Exactly.
Sorry, not to cut you off there, but
again,
we want to talk about the controversies here, and this is one of them. It's just popped into my head it's a small controversy again, I don't want to keep harping that it's unknown, but it is unknown, but this is one of the controversies. Did they do the right thing?
Right. Well, there's been arguments that, the Canadians didn't do a great job of gathering intelligence on who's in the wood, who are we up against here? And so one of the critiques is that they sort of fed in the attacking units a bit piecemeal, and that's what led to this situation. And there are harrowing accounts, like from the Regina Rifles. There's one of the officers, I think Gordon Brown, I think is the name that I've associated with that. I mean, he just says, we walked into crossfire from MG 42s that they let us advance into exactly where they wanted us, and then we had to go to ground. And then the brigadier Sprague, he ends up not being in command of the brigade on the last day of this engagement anymore. So
I mean, it's the accounts are harrowing. I mean, I've seen photos, never been there myself, but I've seen the photos, and it's I don't know, it's like something out of a medieval, I don't know, fairy tale, but a nightmare. This enclosed box
or something
area.
Something out of the Ypres salient from
or something like that. Yeah, I mean, it just sounds so. I don't even know the right word, but like it's just so claustrophobic. And then you come in and you're advancing, and then the Germans have done what they do well when they're limited, is these kind of funneling into killing zones, which Moorland Wood becomes in a lot of ways. And it's a harrowing thing to think about, to read about, and just how hard it was to take such a small area.
And this, of course, when quite a lot of the soldiers, by the end of 44, the fall of 44, were thinking, well, maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel here. And in quite a few of the accounts, you feel that frustration through what they're saying and writing, in that, I kind of thought the worst parts were done, like the Scheldt and Normandy.
Yeah.
And oh my God, I can't believe it's still this awful at this late stage. Everyone knows it's over. They know it's over. We know it's over, but it's still going on.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I did want to ask about this kind of as we moved along. But again, we talked about, we want to keep the German perspective in mind here, because that's what you do with the film. It's an important part of understanding kind of, well, any military history, is because you hear of the fanatical units, the SS. I don't think that's debatable. But like you said, the paratroopers are seen as this elite unit that they're going to fight much harder, like, because we've seen things like Ortona, that kind of thing. Like the paratroopers have that sort of reputation. Like, what is the mindset of the Germans here? Like, because you hear again, this is German territory, German soil, they're going to defend it to the last. So is that what's going on here, or is this just them doing a good job despite being the morale kind of in the basement?
Yeah, I think it's more towards the latter explanation. I mean, it's obviously a mixed bag. The German army is not monolithic. In particular, at this stage, I mean, there are huge differences between units and between these battle groups and all sorts of stuff. So in terms of the paratroopers, I mean, it's not for nothing. They have this reputation as being better than average. I think their combat performance in this campaign is definitely superior to the regular infantry units. There's no question about that. But within those paratrooper units, it's also a mixed bag. And in fact, one good example of that on an individual level is one German veteran of a paratroop unit we managed to interview in spite of pandemic restrictions and so forth. We managed to interview him. I think he's 100 years old or 98 or so. And he was an 18-year-old conscript who never fired a shot in anger. He served mostly as a dispatch runner. So, and yet, he's one of the so-called paratrooper elite in the popular conception, right? So it's not quite that simple. They did also have to impose a lot of draconian disciplinary measures. I mean, they had these special military police, field police, they were called Feldgendarmerie, and they had a wide remit to motivate people by way of violence and execution without a whole lot of formalities. So this is definitely, and Schlemm even says one time, in the campaign, he's like, I was in my staff car or whatever, going from here to there, and I saw troops moving away from the front without clear orders. So I fixed the problem with the military police blocking detachment. So blocking detachment means they're there to not give their own guys a good time if they're going in the wrong direction. So
and again, this is from the North American, Canadian perspective. Those are whispered stories or in movies or that kind of thing. But in this case, it's based on your research and everything you've looked, it's true.
Happened all the time. It was an integrated part of the German military system and military discipline system, starting as far back as after the July plot against Hitler in 1944. And then, of course, it just increases in intensity. And by January 1945, there are these decrees coming out that give officers on the ground essentially free rein to execute people. Also in the civilian realm, executing forced laborers who they don't like the look of or what have you. Forced labor is another thing we have to get to in this chat before we reach the end, by the way.
No, I want to talk about that. I want to kind of end off like the German underknown perspective anyway. So I just want to go back here because I want to talk about kind of broadening our scope again. I want to talk about Grenade and kind of what you've kind of come across with that, and kind of if you could talk more, just more broadly about that. And then I want to talk about Grenade, and then we'll move to Blockbuster, and then we'll see where.
Sure. Yeah, Grenade is supposed to be this second pincer by the U.S. Ninth Army under Bill Simpson, who was, let's say he was known for being a guy who could get along with Montgomery, and amongst the Americans that wasn't always a characteristic that was widespread. And yes, I think that comment that's just come up there is correct. He is criminally unknown, and the Ninth Army plays an absolutely key role here, but also then later again in rushing to the Elbe River in Germany. But the idea for Grenade is really, they're going to use the massive strength they have in armor. They're going to use the wider spaces that they have and the more tricky strategic situation from the German point of view that is in this area to really rush up and capture the German bridges at Wesel, or kind of catch the Germans off guard while they're still facing 1st Canadian Army and surround them and basically capture everybody and all the heavy equipment they have left. Now, the reason why this situation is trickier for the Germans than it is for them to defend against Veritable is, first of all, there's more space. Second of all, they can't easily tell where the Americans are trying to go because Cologne is a major objective, right? Yeah. But the Ninth Army doesn't go due east towards Cologne. It goes northeast towards Düsseldorf, Duisburg, and then eventually Wesel. So, and the Germans have kind of all the army group level reserves that they have are being kind of fed mostly into the defending against Veritable and not against Grenade. So the forces, the 15th Army of the Germans down here is quite weak. They've got a lot of Volksgrenadier divisions, which end up being kind of second-rate divisions. And of course, all the German divisions are massively under strength. It doesn't, even the paratroopers or whatever. So, well, maybe not the first day, but so this means that Grenade, in theory, it should blast through, right? It's got a lot of options. It's a lot of things going for it.
Right.
But those dams, the first U.S. Army wasn't able to take the dams until early February, and the Germans were able to wreck the mechanisms to close the gates. So they didn't blow the dam up, but they wrecked all the big machinery in the position of the gates are open. So 100 million tons of water goes pouring down the Ruhr River, which you can see is the starting point of the Ninth Army. They have to cross it to start the operation. 100 million tons of water is going down that for a couple of weeks, steady. And so they're only able to start February 23rd. But man, then they go through it like a hot knife through butter.
Oh yeah, basically. Like once they cross the river, once they like you said, it's once those. I mean, just seeing the pictures, it's like kind of awe-inspiring. But then like once they get across, it's just like a rapid advance that you had seen in the areas of France. After
exactly
the close of the Follies Gap.
And there are some who have defended the way that this campaign played out against those kind of critics, basically saying, well, it's sort of like what happened in Normandy, where the Brits and Canadians are pinning around Caen in Normandy. Here they're pinning the Germans up in Veritable, and the Americans can swing around with, superior mobility, superior forces that they have,
firepower.
Not as exhausted. Exactly. But, I would say it's worth it to try to judge something on how it was intended to be. And this was intended to be something entirely different, Veritable. The idea was to go through the Germans within a few days to reach those bridges, and it ends up taking, a few weeks. Yeah,
and now because I want to talk about that, we can talk about Blockbuster. So you can talk. I know I want to get to I do want to get to the film soon, but I want to talk about. We have to. It gets kind of confusing, right? We got Veritable. Well, what happened? And then now we got another operation, but Blockbuster is Veritable. And then what happened here?
I guess it's
as quickly as you can make that complicated situation.
I guess it's Veritable 2.0.
That's how I like to think about it.
The renewal of Veritable called Blockbuster. Basically things are not going according to plan. So Crerar decides, we need kind of a reset. And he already brought in 2nd Canadian Corps to take over a bigger role in the campaign starting in the middle of February. And by the 22nd, he decides, okay, we need to revamp things. Mm-hmm. So there's a slowdown in the action then for several days while they get readjusted. 11th British Armored Division is then given to the 2nd Canadian Corps to help. And the idea here of Simmons is from the 26th of February, we're going to break through, or the Allies are going to break through the German positions in a place called the Hochwald Gap. And you can see this large two-part forest is the Hochwald, which literally means high forest. So it's on a hill, and it overlooks all these flat, muddy fields. Exactly, here we see it a bit better. So you can see that tiny little gap between the Hochwald and the smaller forest to the south of us, which is called the Tüchenwald, sometimes the Ballberger Wald. Yeah, and the idea is that we get the armor through there, and we can then break through and outflank the German position based on the town of Xanten, which you can see on the river there. And then the main German resistance here will be broken, and the road to Wesel and the bridges will be all the easier. Mm-hmm. But that is definitely not how it played out. This thing takes a week. You know, the Canadian units are just inching through the mud in that gap, surrounded on three sides. The defenders are a mixture of paratroopers and 116th Panzer Division, who are vastly under strength, but in these circumstances can really make the Canadians pay for every meter of ground. You can see all the small arrows. I mean, we're talking hundreds of meters per day advances. I mean, this is not any kind of breakthrough of any shape, form, or description. There's a railway running through here, so part of the idea is we can convert that railway to a road, send the tanks along it. That doesn't work out either, because you're a sitting duck when you're on a raised embankment trying to drive along. So it's a nightmare. The German combat group that leads the defense of the gap starting on the 27th of February, the colonel leading that is Friedrich Hübner, and he wins the Knight's Cross for the action here, as does the commander of 116th Panzer, who gets the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross for defending against the first few days until they got into the gap. So not to cast German decorations in a positive light necessarily, but it does go to the intensity of the fighting, no question about that. Yeah, and I think it shows, because again, we were talking about morale and issues of resources and reinforcements, that kind of thing. But it shows that the Germans had recognized how important this was. Definitely. I mean, this is their strongest area of defense in the whole thing. So wherever we're talking about late February, where the Americans are with Grenade, where the British are with the southern part of Veritable, this is the strongest part of the German defenses. And that's one of the critiques is, well, then why were they concentrating their attacks here? And Crerar even said at the beginning, look, if it doesn't go well on the 26th, within 24 hours, if we're not on the move, we'll switch the focus to 30 Corps, south of 2nd Canadian Corps. But that doesn't happen, right? No, and we've got we've got a comment that connects to this. Another controversy that is part of all of this is... Indeed. I have to say... Simmons go ahead. Yeah, Simmons is always going to be controversial. You can't avoid it. It's always going to... Well, I would say there's more anti-Simmons views than there are positive Simmons views, but there are a few people. But... I'll let you decide. Like, you can see the question there, so I can kind of let you speak on that, because I don't want to, because I'll put my foot in my mouth and I don't want to do that. So. well, here's the thing. It's an important question, but I've got to recognize here. I'm gonna give a non-answer. I'll be transparent. And the reason is, my familiarity with this campaign, the reading I've done, was really focused to try to convert it into a good, historically responsible narrative that we can use, we can turn into a film. Yeah, exactly. And so I didn't want to spend a ton of time with these kinds of more political aspects, even though they're important. We mentioned them, but I read enough on them to be aware that they exist, to mention them in the film, to make sure that people know that that's an element of the campaign that's debated, but I haven't read enough to take a stand on it. I will say that I have read that people point to Simmons' track record of similar operational quote-unquote mistakes in Normandy, pushing too long,
Right.
too hard against a strong position. As far as I know, there are also some accusations that Simmons kind of went around Crerar, talked to Montgomery, that sort of thing. As I say, it sounds very intriguing. I don't know enough to make a judgment call.
And I mean, that's completely fair. I mean, we could discuss that till the cows come home. But I wanted to, and that's a good question from Sheldrake 6. Sorry, like, and there's the idea. There's another comment here saying that Horrocks should be left in charge. I don't want to get into that because like that's a whole other. That's got too many layers. I'm sorry.
I can see where that comes from.
Me too. That's the thing. I can. Yeah. I mean, I can see that. I can see why. I can see based on what happened, relationships, all that stuff. Throwing Monty into the mix, which always gets people's back up. Throwing Simmons in the mix, for those who know him, gets their back up. That kind of thing. But anyway, I wanted to use the gap here to talk about the film. So, kind of moving towards that sort of. Because you keep talking about how you go about your research and like kind of what you're doing. I was just wondering if you could, maybe this is a good part to start talking about kind of where the idea of this comes from and kind of how you started with all this research. Like, because again, obviously there's a chronological order here, but there's a big lot going on here. So like, how can you go about doing that for film,
Yeah, well, it's kind of an art and a science of its own kind to create a documentary film.
Right.
It started because we had completed this film on the Battle of Berlin, and we're a startup company. We need to generate revenue. So like, okay, well, that worked well. We still are going to need money to live at some stage. Let's do another one. And of course, in the context of the pandemic, some of our options were limited. So we thought to ourselves, well, what can we do with the border restrictions? We don't know how it's going to be throughout the course of the next year. Let's play it safe. Let's pick something else that is focused in Germany. So that, if there are still international travel restrictions, chances are good we can still make a film in Germany. And so we had an intern, Linus, if you're out there and you see this, thank you so much for coming up with the idea. He lives in this area. He's from the town of Emmerich, which is eventually captured by the Canadians, right? And he said, hey guys, maybe, I live right close to this Reichswald. There was big fighting, big battle going on there. I'm like, oh yeah. And then we were sold. Once we looked into Veritable and Grenade, and then it becomes a question of, well, how do you set your limits? What kind of scope do you want to have? Right. And we wanted to make sure that we could show this is going to be our feature project for the Western Front in the late war. So we wanted to have enough there that we could kind of tell the story of the last, set piece, bitter, drawn out campaign in the West. And crossing this, mythical barrier of the Rhine and so on. And so we wanted to kind of bookend that as well as we could. And it just made sense then to include Grenade because operationally, they're under 21st Army Group. They're cooperating towards the same strategic goal as 1st Canadian Army. And we didn't want to leave out then jumping across the Rhine and Operation Varsity with the massive airborne assault. So that's how we sort of bookended it, right? Veritable, Grenade, and then Varsity going across the river. And we wanted, as we always do, to concentrate on as many on-the-ground aspects as we can. So it's not a pure traditional military history ops documentary. We talk about ops, we've got maps with moving units, but we talk a lot about the civilians who are caught in the crossfire. We talk about the forced laborers who are all over the area, not because there's giant concentration camps, but just because they're everywhere. They're on every farm. They're in every cottage industry workshop. They're in the cities working at shops. They're all over. And so, and they're from Holland. They're from the Soviet Union. So we brought in a lot of German research that's been done on German language historical literature that's been done on the forced laborers and their experience, because it was a daily part of life also for the advancing Allied forces, trying to deal with refugees, deal with displaced persons while the campaign is going on. And I think that's an important aspect of it that, for people who start with an interest in military history, we want to reel them into the more complex human picture, let's say. So we kind of tried to combine those as well.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it can't always be, moving arrows on a map and, I want to bash Patton again, but Patton dashing across, southern Germany. That's you can't always do that. That's not the war. The war is all
I was
these
just
human
going to say,
elements. Yeah, like there's all these human elements that have been ignored, I would say, for far too long. So I think you guys are going about this in a really good way. And there's just a few things because you sent me some notes of kind of what you wanted to talk about. And one, I guess I skipped over the first time, but I want to talk about it first because I just saw it. Is someone refused you permission to film?
Yeah, I'm not going to name names here, obviously.
No. I just want
to their rights. Yeah,
of course. This I don't want to call anybody out. Yeah.
No, of course. But this is part of the. Actually, it's part of the learning experience for me as well. Understanding the current day German society's challenges with dealing with history. Now, obviously, there have been massive efforts made in Germany to deal with the country's role in World War II compared to some other countries, like Japan, for example, or even Italy, as we can see now these days, let's leave it at that for the moment. But one example of that is how much good research was done on German war crimes and the treatment of forced laborers, and we used that. And another example is that there was one location that was a prominent building that is intact. It's the same historic building. There was heavy fighting there locally during one of the operations, and we wanted to do a little focus segment of several minutes on the film talking about this one tactical action. And the building now serves a different purpose, a civilian commercial purpose. And so it's privately owned. And so we asked the owners whether we could film there, and this is what we're doing. And, and they said no, they felt it would be bad for business if any people saw that, any more people kind of saw in the film talking about fighting there. There was, it was a German headquarters building for the units around there. Yeah. They had a couple forced laborers working on in that building at the time. Domestic servants, pretty much, but still. And we had an account from one of them, and so on. Who then ends up like screaming at her former master when the Allies are about to capture this little area, like, now you're going to get it, and stuff like that. So we didn't tell them we had that, but they weren't interested. And I think that reveals some of the trickiness of the history even today. But I must say that that's the exception rather than the rule. We had a local guide because we concentrated on a major forced labor camp at Rhine, one of the towns in the area, right? It's liberated eventually by the Scots. It's a major forced labor camp, and there are still ruins of where they housed the forced laborers in an old brick factory. And a local German citizen, just of his own initiative, has done decades of work collecting testimonies, working with survivors, having school kids visit, all this kind of stuff. And he showed us around. He made the right calls at City Hall to get us in to have a look and film. So you get all the different reactions of the German struggle with their own history.
Yeah, and it's, again, we're not calling them out for, it's their building, they can do whatever they want with it, kill you, stay away, don't come back. That's perfectly acceptable. Of course, that's going to happen.
It is. I was disappointed, and we were disappointed, but it is understandable to a certain extent. I'm still not on board with it. I think the right thing to do would be the other decision, but it is their right.
Yeah, and it's not to call them out. It's just I thought that was an interesting, because again, like you said, the German. Again, I'm not speaking for Germans here, but the understanding is it's complex. The war is a complex legacy. I mean, they have.
No kidding.
Yeah, I mean, an understatement of the century, right, in the millennium. But it's just, what I mean. It's just there's so much going on here. I think sometimes it gets forgotten. Especially on this side of the Atlantic, we kind of think about bad Germans, and there's all this kind of stuff going on here that like people nowadays are not comfortable talking about sometimes, or like you just said, it's bad for business. Maybe they're right. They could be. I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to say like no doing history stuff, but like that happens. And another thing too, because it comes to mind, because there was supposed to be a live stream on World War II TV with Paul Woodhatch that got delayed because of weather. you mentioned weather as one of the things in your notes. I was just wondering, like, because we've seen the photos, like, what does that mean for filming in the 21st century? Like, what does that mean? Is it too cold, windy?
Oh
I'm Canadian. I live in Ottawa. I don't, to be bad weather is like, snow up to my window. So, you know what I mean? I just wonder if you could speak about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, as far by the standards of filming and film crew comfort, it was miserable. We were there in March, so we were there at the same time, the campaign happened. It was just, on most days, it was absolutely miserable. Not in the same way that Ottawa winter is miserable, but in its own Northwestern European way, which means it can be 3 degrees or 5 degrees, and you are freezing because it's so wet, and it was raining a bunch of the time. There was a depression, low pressure system that came through, so there was a huge windstorm. We had a drone to get drone shots and stuff and film like the lay of the land and all that. And after day 2, I mean, our drone was about to be basically carried off to Russia or something by the wind. So we had to can the drone, and Tony went back. Our team member who operates the drone had to go back later. So if you ever have the chance to watch or if you buy access to the documentary, or anybody watching does, I hope I did a good job, at least in the rough cuts of the episodes so far in the editing. I think I did a pretty good job of hiding in just what kind of agony I was from being wet and frozen. Although you can see sometimes my nose is bright red, like when we're filming on the banks of the Rhine, like where Churchill crossed over on the day after plunder. I mean, my nose is beet red because it's just raw from the cold wind.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I mean, like I said, I haven't been to this area, but I was in... where was I? I was on the Somme, actually. This kind of similar idea. I was around Courcelette, Sugar Trench, and it was June 1st, I believe. So, hey, good weather, Northwest Europe. It snowed.
June is still dicey.
It snowed. It was like, oh, come on, guys. Like, come on. I just came from the bad weather. I need something nice. But anyway, yeah. So, like, I think those things are good if you can hide them, but, I mean, it's expected. Especially if you know this stuff, or you read these campaigns. It's not like the weather's going to change after the last 80 years. Weather stays fairly consistent, again, with these things. So I think it's really interesting that you guys were able to push through and kind of get this out. And around the same time of year that the operations happened. I mean, that's impressive to me, at least, from doing the limited amount of filming I've done and things like that. So.
Yeah, obviously, we had a way easier time of it than anybody who was there during the campaign, goes without saying.
Yeah.
But yeah, we... well, hey, I mean, we're motivated. Like, 1, it's our livelihood. 2, we're a small startup. Once we spring the budget open for this filming trip, like, we're doing it. Come hell or high water. Yeah. It's happening, right? Barring, hurricane, that's how it's going to be. So we managed. And I was reminded when we were there why Montgomery, initially in the fall of 44, when they were first planning for this operation, before the bulge kind of delayed everything, he said, this area is not suitable until at least later in March. And because of the circumstances, it got launched in early February, and we've talked about the rest. So,
and we see why that happens the way it does. I mean, and that's part of it. The bulge throws these things into uncertainness, I guess is the best way to say it at the time, because again, like we've already talked about, I kind of want to use that to segue into our next topic that we were going to talk about, kind of the under-discussed things, the things we wanted to touch on that are not talked about. I mean, the bulge gets lots of attention. We can debate about that all day long, what that looked like. I mean, there's some new stuff coming out about that and what it all meant and what it actually looked like and what it was going to do to the Allied war effort. Anyway, I don't want to give that more attention. But these under talked about topics that I think you guys are going to be bringing to light. Like you said, you're going to be using interviews and perspectives from the forced labor. So I wonder if you could just talk about that real quick.
Sure, yeah. We did we did interviews live with this German veteran. We desperately wanted to get an Allied veteran, and our best shot was a British veteran, obviously geographically. But with the pandemic and movement restrictions, we didn't want to try to do it remotely with a centenarian. And so, there were some limits, but it was an amazing achievement, we feel, to be able to have gotten some firsthand testimony by this veteran. We used a lot of transcripts of interviews with forced laborers that have been done by a foundation in Holland about forced laborers in the area, and also in Germany as well, including Soviets, which I'm not going to say my Russian is fluent, but I was able to bash through a couple of and find a few short excerpts that I translated. So I hope that really adds an extra element to the film. We've got maps. We had some great partners for this project as well. We partnered up with Project 44, Canadian-based project for mapping, which I know you've worked with them before. So we're really happy about that. They gave us a lot of support. Special thanks to Drew for giving me some copies of some archival documents that I couldn't get quick enough through LAC. And we also worked with a few, I know. We also worked with a few other history YouTubers based in Germany who talks about the air war, military aviation history. We worked with the Tank Museum in England to help talk about the armored warfare. I mean, they put out great stuff online all the time.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, we worked as well with Matthew Moss, who has a YouTube channel that specializes in firearms history. So we have like live firing of like a battery of Vickers heavy machine guns.
Oh, wow.
And then he talks about how the pepper pot, small caliber bombardments would have worked and that sort of thing. And God, I hope I'm not forgetting anybody, but it was just, I really feel like that adds a whole element. It's not just me narrating the whole 4 hours. We've got other experts who know far than I could have ever learned in the 6 months that I basically read up and studied for this project in their respective areas. And so we really tried to sort of cover all of our bases. We've got deals with different archives for the footage. Sometimes that's still kind of tricky. We've got specialist guys for animating the maps and so on. We go down to divisional level. We actually even go down to company level for a couple of tactical examples. So we pulled out all the stops, man. We did the best we could with the resources that we had. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, not to go off topic too much, but like getting onto the company level is so difficult, and especially when you're trying to mix it in with narrative. And like, I'm not saying you guys are doing, that's great. Like, I mean, mixing all this different stuff, I think that's the way these documentaries are going anyway, and you guys are on the forefront with that. Cause I mean, I wish I could do that with my stuff. I really do, but it's just me. But anyway, I don't want to go on about that, but anyway, like, that's just amazing to hear that. Like, you guys are able to mix all these different elements together when you usually only get one or two. So that to me is amazing. And I wanted to say before I forget again that the links for all this stuff is going to be in the description below, so you can check these guys out, look at all the stuff, go on the website. It's great. I did a lot of poking around. Looks really interesting. So I'm looking forward to what you guys can do with that. But with that said, I just wanted
before I forget, by the way, apologies for interrupting. Before I forget, with those links down there, there's like a corollary supporting project that we have alongside of this, and that's I'll be giving on the 30th of May a virtual battlefield tour of the Hochwald Gap action with another partner company of ours in the UK, virtual Battle Guide virtual tours. So that link will be there as well.
Yeah, that link is in there now. So yeah, you can check that out. I was looking there. I forgot. I've been doing so much the last couple of days. I forgot. Yeah, I was looking at that last night. It looks really cool because I've seen that website before. Did some poking around. I think there was a Vimy Ridge one that I may have inadvertently offended someone by calling them out that it was less money, but that's okay. They said it was because it was subsidied, so that's fine.
It was a special occasion.
Yeah. I was like, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to call you out. But anyway. I do the Canadian stuff. My goal is to call it Canadian stuff. Sorry. But anyway, no, the stuff is great. It's really, I think it's the forefront. I keep saying this on so many different forums that this is the way things are going to go anyway. I think regardless of pandemic, it's great. So we just got a question about the film. It's going to be in the link I put down there in the description. Yeah. Oh, sorry. It was when will they be coming out? I guess that's a good question.
It's going to be released in 5 phases, one for each episode, starting, I believe, the first week of June. But I'm not responsible for the release schedule, but that's when it's going to be coming. Anybody can Google Rhineland 45. I think we're the first hit on that, or there's the link in the description. And then you can pre-order, and you'll get the download codes the day that a new episode comes out. So
perfect. Yeah, we're not going to hold you to the release dates because I know that's it's good to have a rough idea, So kind of I wanted to talk about a few things that I think, like I keep saying, are under discussed And one of them in particular is because we've talked about this. We talked about this a bit on Twitter, though, is the German sources.
Yes.
And you speak and read German.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, two parts to that. I was wondering if you could speak to your experience working with these German sources. Again, we know that that can be a bit of a dicey thing because of the way the Germans portrayed themselves, especially those who were involved.
Exactly.
But also how you go about using them in something like this. And then I want to talk about, so I don't forget, kind of the underutilization of German sources by English-speaking academics, historians, public historians, everybody.
That is true, yeah.
And I want to talk about that too.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm in a uniquely lucky position of having moved here to Austria in 2010, and before that I lived for a year in Germany as well. So it has been easier for me to learn German, obviously, living here than people elsewhere in non-German speaking countries. But this is a critical element. I mean, to me, this is, and you can't get around using it if we want to do the kind of film that we want to do, right? So there has been quite a bit published in German about these campaigns, but it's not the same kind of historical approach or literature that you would typically find in English, for example. The Germans are not big on operational histories. It's not the main focus generally of historical literature. There's some, but in a situation like this, where the campaign also on the German side is not as well known or famous as the ones in the East or Normandy or the Ardennes, the Bulge, whatever, there were some limits. So basically, I had a few options. One was I ordered quite a few local works of history.
Okay.
So focusing on this particular town, and it was published, by the town archives, all the way from the 60s up until the 2000s. Wow. So there's one for Xanten during the war. There's one for Emmerich. There's a local historian who wrote about his home village and the surrounding area in Grenade, for example. Oh. And these things are irreplaceable. I mean, they have a level of detail. They draw on interviews with people who were there, civilians and German soldiers, German veterans, that were never accessible to Anglosphere historians, let's say, from the English-speaking world. And also, they're more willing to talk to a local German historian than they would be to a stranger who shows up knocking on doors or calling people or cold emailing in later times and so on. Now, that doesn't solve the problem of assessing the content of what they say or what they write, but we need to have something. We need to be able to use something, and we work with what we have. Another critical piece was the divisional history of the 116th Panzer for the last year of the war. Was written by the head staff officer of that division, who happened to be Heinz Guderian's son, Heinz Günther Guderian. Can't get more German than that, Heinz Günther.
No, you cannot.
And he drew on a lot of his old boys, diaries and the telephone records for the division, in addition to the divisional war diary. So he's drawn on a massive corpus of stuff that is essentially untouchable to historians who don't have access to the German archives, or there's a language barrier that's too much, and they don't have the money to fund a German-speaking, researcher or whatever. Which I wish that they all had, because I think better history would come out of it.
I agree.
So I had to assess these sources for what they say. I stayed away from, I was very careful selecting what parts I used. I wanted personal accounts that show personal experiences and opinions. I wanted to fill in some gaps in terms of unit locations or the perspective of what they thought of a certain engagement's importance or outcome. But I was cautious. I relied obviously more on contemporary literature, which is mostly in English. The few contemporary things I had in German about military operations were very high level. And so they were good to get a general idea, but the local stuff is really what let me fill in the gaps in a way that I think is not that commonly found in an English language public history project. So.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's an important part. I mean, I do want to. I'm kind of struggling how to like ask this. I know there's a language barrier, and I think that plays a part. But and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But is there an unwillingness, other than the language part, to use German sources because of German conduct, Nazi Germany conduct? Period. Like, is there that sort of like, oh, these guys are Nazis, we don't want to use the Nazi sources? Like, is there that a bit, or do you think it is just a purely location language issue?
Well, I mean, that's hard to say. Obviously, I know some Canadian historians, but not all. So it's hard for me to judge. My sense is that it's almost a cultural thing.
Okay.
My sense is that, you know, in the English-speaking world, we don't have to engage as much with literature and sources in other languages unless you're a real specialist in something.
Right.
That makes it, you know, unavoidable. If you're interested in military history, in particular in operations, then, you know, the libraries are filled with good historical work that explains stuff, that brings to light things, but that does not use any German sources whatsoever, or only
right.
snippets of, you know, prisoner interrogations that were translated at the time on the fly.
Right.
You know, prisoners say things in certain ways as well. So it's just so limited, and I think it's just something that doesn't seem, it's not yet normal and assumed that it is kind of required as a part of writing about a particular campaign. If you want to do that, if you want to kind of say, yeah, I'm trying to understand this whole campaign.
Right.
And I think that that's still a shortcoming that we have in the English-speaking world. And part of the reason is, you know, just the status of the English language today means that we don't learn foreign languages as much. And yeah, we can do a lot without it. And unfortunately, I think that leads to complacency to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it's seen as, yeah, it's a complacent sort of attitude. I mean, there's funding issues like you already mentioned, the language issues. We don't teach language the way we should, particularly not in Canada. I mean, that's my experience with all of this. I mean, I have a French Canadian background. I don't speak hardly any French. I mean, I'm from London, Ontario. Not a lot of French down there ever. But I mean, it hurts me in a sense because what I even want to look at for Canadian units, sometimes it slows me down. Like I can slog through it, but it's difficult, and I think that's holding us back, like you said. And I think technology is helping, like things like translating, and it's not great, but it's a start. I mean, better than it was even a few years ago. I mean, you still have to think critically about it and understand it, but I think it's something that can be changed. And I think, like you said, it's a cultural attitude issue that I kind of hope people kind of start to change their minds on. Another cultural issue that you've raised with in the past, and I have as well, is this sort of, how do I say this? Like this, I would say it's not an obsession, a focus on defeat and failure. And somehow Veritable becomes part of this. Not a failure by any means. Yeah, it's difficult and it's not easy, but it's not a failure. The objectives are met, just not on schedule. And I wondered if, because you brought this up in the notes, we've talked about this before, is why you think that happens. And I mean, you're Canadian, but you've been outside the country. So maybe you can kind of get a different perspective on maybe a little bit, looking outside of what kind of this sort of thing we go about it. And sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but before you start, like there are people who disagree with me that say it's not a focus on defeat. We don't focus on defeat, or we don't anymore. But I still think we do. And like you said, Veritable is part of this. And I was just wondering kind of your kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I think we focus on extremes. And we focus on what is the most emotional in a way, which is strange to say in a discussion about, academic history and research and so on to some extent, but emotion is a part of it. It's a part of that popular narrative. It's a central part of it, in fact. And so I think that's why we tend to those extremes. There's emotion, compelling emotion in victory and compelling emotion in defeat, and much less in stalemate, let's say, for example. But as far as Veritable is concerned, I was struck because it's a bit weird. It's like, it reads like a defeat within what is actually, let's say, a limited victory or a qualified victory.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
The Germans are defeated in this campaign. They're not defeated in the way that they were intended to be by the Allied commanders or on the timeline, as you said.
Yeah.
And the losses obviously were far heavier in 1st Canadian Army than what was hoped for. But that doesn't mean it's a full-on defeat, even though it kind of reads that way. And interestingly, a lot of veteran testimony reads that way, that they feel like, the action they were in was a total slaughter disaster for whatever action, they're reporting on. And I guess, from the foxhole view in the mud, that's certainly a legitimate place to come from in that moment.
Of course.
So Veritable, I felt, is weird. It's like a defeat wrapped up, to paraphrase Churchill very badly on Russia here, it's like a defeat wrapped up in the enigma of a sort of victory. And I feel like in general, I have to admit, I do feel like, I think I told you when this first came up on Twitter, I think my 2 cents was we focus more on victory, except maybe for Dieppe. And the more I think about it, the more I'm not sure that I would still put it so firmly. I think we like to focus overall on victory, and I think that's probably why Normandy is, by far the most prominent one.
Right.
But within that victory, when you drill down to the next level, okay, well, World War II, a victory, and we had Normandy. Well, then what else did we have? Well, we had Dieppe. Well, we had all the awful positional warfare in Italy. Well, there was Hong Kong. So it's almost like all these little defeats narratives somehow lend a sort of, I don't want to go too far, but the word that comes to mind is like martyr-like meaning to the overall victory.
Yeah, right? I understand what you're saying. Yeah, like there's this. Yeah,
the defeats strengthen the meta victory. Let's put it that way.
Right, and I was gonna say, like, I think it's this sacrifice, this concept of sacrifice, which is a leftover from the First World War, but it's too much sacrifice in a way. I think comes up a little bit. I think that's maybe another way of putting it is we focus on because I think that's perfect way of thinking of Veritable. Like, we're supposed to crush them in a day and a half, not even close. Like, it wasn't even close to that, is that, like you said yourself, and I think it is a fair assessment, like looking at things from their objectives and what happens with Veritable. I think that is a fair assessment, but sometimes things go things don't always go to plan. And yeah, like there's we got another, I'll throw it up here, but and I think this is kind of part of it, and I don't necessarily disagree. I haven't got a chance. I've been so busy with everything else. I haven't got a chance to dig into Cinderella Army as much as I'd like, but there's a little bit of that there too. Yeah, Blockbuster was a waste, but there's more than just a military factor there. I mean, obviously you can't just say, you're done. We're not going to let you do this with the Canadians. It's over. Like, that's never going to happen. Right. Like, so like that's part of this, but again, like this kind of focus on this failure. And again, I do so much work with this. My dissertation's about Hong Kong, about a failure, and kind of the way we look at it. I mean, I argue this at the conference last weekend, and my own papers and everything. It's a defeat, and there's negatives here. Of course there are, and we're not going to just say stop talking about them. But there's other things here that are not even talked about enough, or that are purposely tampered down. Now, again, I don't know enough about all the historiography of Veritable to speak to that, but like this idea that someone gains from it being seen so poorly. And I think there's things like the official histories come into play here. We can even expand that to Grenade, like was already been mentioned. Like, he's too buddy-buddy, Americans that are too buddy-buddy with Monty, that's bad. Monty's, bad and got American boys killed in Holland for no reason. That kind of thing. Like, so I think that's part of how this can be looked at, in a sense, is if we can just stop for a second and be like, okay, yeah, it's bad, but what's actually making it look bad, or what led to our perceptions of bad? And this and I'm going to connect to the film for you, because again, I don't mind talking about products that I think are good and are going to offer some historical value. But I think the way that we've talked, the way you've discussed it, the way that the filming can be done, and especially with 21st century technology and all the access to things we have, we can tell different stories in a different way. I'm come from an academic background. I mean, I do academic work myself, but there are limitations to what can be done. You guys don't. You guys have other limitations. Whether
I was going to say everyone has limitations, but
freezing on the Rhine when you don't think you're going to be freezing, but you're freezing. Or whoever someone's going to tell you, no, we don't want filming on our site. But the way we look at these things is we get caught up in a lot, and I think a lot of stuff gets recycled without really a critical eye, and it's just sometimes it's too slow. It takes decades for these little nuances to get looked at, but you guys can do that faster. I mean, that's part of my own work is like, yeah, I can do academic work. I can write an article that takes forever to write and publish, and then 10 people will read it, and that's the end of it. If I can do something like this, it's going to hit more people.
It is going to hit more people, but the important thing that I always, since I'm primarily responsible for the research and the script writing in the team, yep. Not exclusively, there's a lot of feedback, and we have outside researchers who help me out with particular topics and so on. But I'm standing on the shoulders of the academic work that's been done, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to synthesize, distill the conclusions of that and the debates within the learned, community of people who spend their careers focusing on these things, whereas I focus on it for 8 months for one project. Right. I want to funnel that into something that can reach all these other people, but not in a superficial, sensationalistic kind of, what the History Channel has now become sort of way. Exactly. And not in a, and you will appreciate this working on Hong Kong, also not in a Valor in the Horror kind of way.
Right.
There's a place to showing the horror of war and the waste and the suffering and the mistakes and all that kind of stuff without beating on a one-directional drum, for the whole thing. That's not our approach. We curate the information that goes in there for sure. I have I make decisions about what goes in and how I hope that it will come across, but I also try to place a bit of a limit on how far I then develop that. So I'll place things in there and hope that the viewers can then use their own learning experience to draw some of their own conclusions.
Right, and I think that's a completely. That's how I would do it. I mean, like I mentioned that conference I did last week, and my conclusion is that we need to look at the sources of these assumptions and then say, okay, yeah, there's bad, and Veritable is an example of this. I mean, you could run the list. Valor and the Horror just gets my blood going, and I don't want to talk about them too much. They get enough attention, but like I mentioned them because it's part of Hong Kong. But Barrier Ridge, you could talk about that. Bomber Command, it all comes part of this. Yes, show, like you said, show the horror. But like I like to always say, pause, hold on a second, let's think about this. Yeah, you can show it. It's not saying don't show that. I'm also saying don't chuck out the official histories, the academic work. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is we need some more nuance here. A little more nuance isn't going to hurt anybody. We need to understand this a little differently. And I think that the way you guys are going about it is a great way. And I mean, even if it just, I don't know what the right word is, but like if it's a more surfacey to get people to read more, that's bang on, because this is how the assessments change. This is how tensions change. And I think that's a great part of public history, why I'm being so drawn to it now myself, why I love doing these live streams, making videos, doing it in a different way, is because I want it to be looked at in a different way. So why expect, I don't want to just be another academic yelling into the void. Well, I can't even do an academic job anyway, but that's besides the point. I want to try it differently because I think it's changing anyway. Audiences are changing, and it's up to us to change with them, not expect them to fit our mold. But anyway, I'm preaching the choir here. We're live streaming on YouTube. Yeah, we're live streaming on YouTube, and and you're doing this stuff all the time. So I mean, it's preaching to the choir. But so I think we can wrap up a little bit here. We're getting over the hour, so I think this is a good time to call it in. Is there anything else that I may have skipped that you wanted to bring some quick attention to? Anything like that? Kind of a wrap up.
I probably forgot a whole bunch of stuff, but I just want to thank you for having me on today, and I hope that anybody out there watching this, that we've been able to pique your interest in general in the Rhineland campaign, but perhaps also specifically for the Rhineland 45 movie that we produced with Real-Time History, and maybe also for the Hochwald-Gap virtual tour. And of course, all the links are going to be put up in the description, because I think that these are important topics. Yes, it's my job, it's my career. I need people to be interested in the public history films that we make to pay my rent. But at the same time, I hope that these films can play a role in the public discussion about World War II history in a way that's responsible and ethical and good for, civic society and people's individual kind of educational experiences. So that's kind of the whole point of why we chose to do the film, and I hope that people are interested and that can come through to them when they buy and watch it.
Yeah, so everybody, the links are down below. Check it out. I was digging through, like I said, there's lots of good stuff on there. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the other documentary. I do want to check it out at some point, the Fall of Berlin documentary, because that was all over social media. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. It was great. Like the things that you guys were talking about, I'm like, oh my God, this is interesting. I don't have time because I'm doing 80,000 things myself. But like, hopefully sometime I can get a time to relax and look at this stuff. But anyway, it looks like you guys are doing some great work. Everybody check out the links. Just go along. Yes, it does need to be paid for. Like, and again, that's not bad, but you can check out the website. That's free. So just go look. That's what I'm saying. Go look. That's free for now until they change the internet on us. But anyway, go look, check it out. So thanks a lot, Jesse, for coming on. I'm going to come say goodbye to you in a second, but I'm just going to wrap this video up. So thanks everybody for watching this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. Thanks a lot for coming on. Some great questions, good discussion with Jesse. Thanks for supporting the channel. If you're not a subscriber, I know I harp on this, but it helps me so much. If you subscribe, the more people I have subscribing, more people I have liking the videos, commenting, the better the channel can do, and I can keep doing this stuff. I don't want to stop, so any help you guys can give would be great. Also, the Patreon link is in the description as well. So if you guys can support me in any way you can, that would be greatly appreciated so I can keep doing this work. I think it's important. I enjoy it. You guys seem to really enjoy it, so let's keep this going. So thanks, everybody. And for those of you in Got the Long Weekend come up, enjoy. Hopefully we did a good start for you. So have a good day, everybody.